Let's pray. Lord, thank you that we have this time together and we appreciate the technology that makes it possible and delighted to have Kerry with us. And we pray that you'll inspire him, Father, as he leads our discussion. And we thank you that we can address these issues that tell us so much about who you are and what you have done in this world. And Lord, thank you for giving us a place in it and an ability to participate in the work that you're doing. So we devote this time to you, Lord. We pray that you'll bless and inspire and direct. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks,
Amen.
Ted.
Thank you, Ted.
So, for those who are watching this later, we are continuing our conversation looking at T.F. Torrance's Theological Science. We're in chapter 6, beginning chapter 6 today for 2 weeks with Kerry, and then they'll have me for a week, and then we'll finish with Jerome Van Kijken in a few weeks after that. So, it's been a long, um, slow, only in that we've taken time to savor it. Not that it's been in any sense boring or anything like that, but it's a book that's appropriate to taking appropriate time. So as we enter into chapter 6, which is titled Theological Science Among the Special Sciences, Kerry is of special value in that he's the curator of the collection of the history of science at the University of Oklahoma. And Kerry, you can correct all the language of how that's actually labeled. And to say that you have a long history with T.F. Torrance, he was inspirational in kind of your development of your own understanding of the nature of the history of science generally, within which this work applies, and particularly as we go into this final chapter. So I'm going to pass it to you here. And the one other thing is, I had somebody say, if you're to give me a book to begin just reading on the history of science, not specifically theological science, what book would you recommend? Somebody who says, I'm interested in the history of science, what book would you put in my hands to do that? This is a PhD in New Testament, so he's an intelligent person he wants a good book that can begin to survey the field.
Oh boy, what a great question to start off with. My goodness, history of science is uh, a a special science. It's a field, a professional field with its own academic literature, but it's one of those cross-cutting kinds of fields that looks at both history and nature. So it's kind of hard to define exactly what it is. But what I would say is look for actual works that are familiar with the scholarship in written by historians of science, not merely by journalists, not merely by scientists. Respect the profession by looking for the scholarship in the field, and there's plenty of it to choose from. Um, One magnificent place to start would be, especially if you're interested in the last couple centuries of science, especially if you're interested in science and religion or science in an English-speaking context. Well, you can't beat studying the figure of James Clerk Maxwell, and we've needed for so long a work on Maxwell that Bruce, thank you. I see you're here, and I love recommending your book. So there's some free publicity. Yeah, thank you, Bill. If you all haven't read that, boy, pull that one out. That's a great place to start.
And getting that book is that one of the challenges here in the States is getting that book, right? So
Yeah,
Bill
yeah.
has been able to do that. So we have
I,
to figure out how that can happen.
I will say this for undergraduate classes, we teach over 600 students a semester in our department in undergraduate courses. And I especially love the 300 level survey classes. One goes from the beginning to Newton, and the other goes from Newton to the present. And that Maxwell book would be the type of book we could include in that second half of the survey from Newton to the present. Um, I I really like. I'll give you an example of one book from each of those surveys. So, if you wanted to start off with the ancient medieval, David Lindbergh has a book called The Beginnings of Western Science. It's now 25 years old, but it's still a fantastic survey.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, that one ends up about 1500. So uh, pick your book after that. Maybe one survey on early modern science that I would pair with it. I've used Margaret Osler's book on early modern science. I can't think of the name of it. A survey text, not a specialized monograph. John Henry has a really good overview of the early modern science. For the modern course, a, a book just titled Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives by John Hedley Brooke. It's now 25 years old also, but still a sound and still a tremendously crafted overview.
Hmm.
Now, since it's on science and religion, that might be surprising, but it turns out he writes with such texture and nuance. It's a great book that we still use in survey courses
Huh.
sometimes. So
Very
I
good.
was so thrilled my first year here as a graduate student in the program. Uh, Someone came to teach a master course on Newton, a visiting scholar, Richard Westphal, Never at Rest. That's the standard textbook on Newton. But to prepare us for that, his introduction was The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis.
Huh.
That classic, always in print, still in print by Canto Press, Cambridge. You can't beat it to really set up medieval and early modern science. It still holds up very well.
Huh.
In fact, several people I know ha actually made a turn to history of science because of The Discarded Image.
Huh.
So it's a powerful book, but be careful because you read a book like that and oh my goodness, if you get the itch, then who knows where that's going to all
Who
lead.
knows?
Yeah.
Good things, probably.
Yes.
So, so you are continuing on teaching there, and you are also the primary person who facilitates the TF Torrance website. And so, do you want to say
Along
anything
with
about what you've been doing on the website? Because I really appreciate what you do there, and you're improving. So,
Oh, thank you. Along with Brent Perkable. So we work together on getting the website running, and we're currently in the process of trying to work out a migration to update the Drupal, which um, needs it. But one of the new initiatives is to try to go back and add the past um, reading group episodes, both the videos and the handouts, to all the records. And I think that's really important to make these conversations discoverable. In the same way, from Bob Walker, we've been given recordings of all of the Loch Tay Torrance retreats through the years. And now he doesn't have recordings of every retreat, but more than half of them. And of the recordings that he has, more than half that he's given to us, more than half of those have already been converted to an internet-friendly form and put online. So those are starting to go up as well. And so there are many, many hours of Loctay retreats and uh, going up that I think will be helpful resources to add there as well. And I
excellent.
think you've already discussed it, one of those in this reading group. Thank you, Marty, for being
We
with
did
it.
Jeremy Bigby's a few weeks ago.
Yeah,
So
right. Yeah.
yeah, so good. I just want to make sure that we don't let those things get buried somewhere, but that they're being brought out to.
Oh, one other thing I'll mention is just this week, Jerome Van Kyken delivered all the files for the next issue of Participatio. I don't know when we'll get to it, hopefully before the summer's over, but the files are all there. They're now in our inbox, and
Nice.
it's an issue that's a tribute to Chris Kettler on the
Huh,
vicarious humanity of Christ. And so can't wait to get that issue out. I think everybody will really enjoy that issue of Participatio.
excellent, excellent. Good. Well, we were talking before you came on, and I think it was Ken who was just saying what an amazing handout you've produced here. So
Oh, thanks.
it's clear, it invites conversation. It's just everything we want. in a handout for a reading group. So
Well, thank you. I hope it's helpful as a companion to actually reading,
yes,
because sometimes, Torrance's points may not be quite obvious on the first reading, and maybe to have a summary as you go can help. The purpose is to bring more people into Torrance.
yes, exactly. And I do get virtually every week somebody who says, I've been watching the videos, or this last week, unfortunately, was I've been watching Bryden on that, and
Oh,
Biden passed. But for
yeah.
to have a memory of him that people can still hear his voice, I'm just so delighted that we had the years that we did have,
Oh,
that now
yes.
people have the ability to hear what it is that he contributed. Um, so anyway, people are having all kinds of value and learning and extending conversations because of the recordings and the handouts as well. So thank you for that. So today we begin a chapter of theological science among the special sciences, and you divide kind of into two sections for today. You've got the introduction, which is pages 281 to 286. And that's basically the first page. And then you go on to similarities between theology and the other sciences. And next week, we'll be going into the differences. So as you have stated, each non-indented bullet point below represents a specific paragraph. So where there's a bullet point to the far side, that's the paragraph. And then underneath it, the bullet point is a question that we can ask about what's going on there. Am I reading that right?
Right. The sub points are all about that particular paragraph. Yeah.
Very good. So, is there anything you want to say before we just dive into just about your general sense of entering into this particular final chapter?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If I were doing it right this moment, I don't know why I didn't think of this. The title, Theological Science Among the Special Sciences. We're 90% there as soon as we've got the title, because all of a sudden we're realizing that we live in a universe with multiple sciences. Now, think back to the last time you heard some scientist on TV um, talking about uh, issues wildly outside their area of expertise. Well, none of us want to be that guy, right? We and especially in theology, when we're trying to honor God and to know Him, we want to practice theological science with integrity. And I don't know about you all, but I am so struck by the people that I have seen who are at the pinnacle of their scientific field when they know the limits of that field. And when they come up against those limits, they stop. And then they recruit, openly welcome
Hmm.
someone from a neighboring science and they pass the discussion over. Now, now often think of it. We have a grandson now. He's 18 months old. And, it's pretty fun to think about the toys he has in his bathtub. And imagine that we're sitting in the bathtub and we've got these little floating blocks, and each block is a science. There are a lot of sciences in this bathtub that God has given us. And so now and then we pick up the theology science block. Sometimes we pick up the astronomy science block or the geology science block or whatever they are. And so just with this title, we're recognizing we're in a universe of who knows how many sciences, but there are a lot of different sciences. And whenever we are speaking in a scientific way, we're picking up one of those blocks. And it's important to just kind of keep in mind, are we picking up the block that is appropriate to the question that we're investigating? And
Hmm.
are we involving the other sciences appropriate to a question so that we're not just being that person who thinks that their science makes them qualified to speak on everything.
Hmm. Is there somebody you think of who's done that well in the scientific world where you say that person, they've really recognized the limitation and they've created an open space?
Yeah. I I I see that all the time, but I remember um, being so impressed with my father's youngest brother, who was a physician. And some of you may know I was in medical school for quite a while, and um, before I left it to pursue these questions that I couldn't resolve as a physician. And I did an internship early on, a month-long internship with this family practitioner in southern Missouri, and he was really a superb um, small town family practitioner, obstetrician, gynecologist. But what struck me at the end of that month was how instantaneously he could pivot in caring for a patient where he could, in all likelihood, he would be all that that patient needed. But there was no ego involved at all. In a moment's notice, he was on the phone calling a collaborator in town or preparing to ship them off to Kansas City. And just to see that knowledge of his own bounds, not where he could say, I don't know enough to make a good guess, but it's really important to give the patient the best possible care. And this condition nudges up against what's appropriate to treat in this small town by a family practitioner.
Mm,
Oh, that made me so that just a lasting
yeah.
impression. That was the model of this scientific attitude.
Mm,
We're one among many sciences. And so to live in this multifaceted world, we must engage with others. There's a whole circle of sciences, and we've
mm.
got to work together.
Beautiful. I hear a kind of a kaleidoscopic sense there. There's a common set of themes, but light shines through it, and as it moves and turns, there is a beauty in not trying to lock something down, but allowing for the movement of each to interface with the others to create the beauty of the patterns and all that come from it.
That's right, exactly. And maybe I can add this. Here's my hypothesis that Torrance is implying in the chapter. And as we go through, tuck this away, and maybe at the end of the whole chapter or at the end of the whole book, test this. Is Torrance making the suggestion, or even more strongly, making the argument that theology is such an interesting science, or interesting is the word. Theology is such a central science because it has the opportunity to connect in a meaningful way with every other science.
Does the word facilitating work there? It's such a facilitating science.
Yes, it can have a resonance or a conversation with a dialogue with every other science.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very often that some sciences necessarily interact with each other. Some are close enough they interact all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but others may be kind of remote. Is it the case that the theologian has something to talk about with every other scientist in the room
Mm-hmm.
as a theologian? And that I think is where Torrance is going, and why he's interested in creating a chapter
Mm-hmm.
on the special sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Ted has written, and thus the importance of humility coupled with an active curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, the really profound scientists in any field really are characterized by both humility and curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Well said.
Beautiful. So diving into your point one, then introduction, your statement on this first point, first paragraph, theology is the unique science devoted to the knowledge of God. So uniqueness is certainly part of it, devotedness to the knowledge of God, the priority there. And you ask the question, why are other sciences not devoted to the knowledge of God?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not saying that knowledge of God doesn't help us.
Yes.
We want to do our science in light of all we know. But we're not looking at God as God. We're looking in light of God at the contingent realities he has made.
And to ask a history of science question, there was a point where theology was called the queen of the sciences. And I'm wondering if it was, in a sense, assumed that theology was, in a sense, that which made all of the other sciences devoted to a knowledge of God and God's work, but not departing from God. Is that a fair statement to say, or and did something get lost there?
Um, I don't know. It depends. One of the things that you find as soon as you start reading treatises on theology, especially in the scholastic period or in the post-Reformation scholasticism as well, that owed a lot to the scholastic dialogues, is that uh, they tended to begin. Just try, for example, Thomas Aquinas' Summa.
Mhm.
Um, and it's totally typical in beginning with the question, is theology a science? And then what one has to consider immediately is, well, what's a science? And in the Middle Ages, a science was typically that on which one has demonstrative causal knowledge, which is more than saying it's not just opinion. It's saying you can have a knowledge of causes. But but that but you're immediately then involved in comparing theology and the other sciences, the same type of discussion that Torrance is having here. Now, this is rightly at the toward the end of the book. He's not doing this, trying to tackle the question, what kind of science is theology a priori? He's been letting theology become disclosed in its own way so that once we get to a place where we're able to talk about theology as a science, we're doing it on its own ground, its own, it has achieved its own nature by our development of it, rather than coming to it with some a priori idea of what makes something a science. But but anyway, the queen of the sciences idea had multiple ways of being implemented depending on that first section of these treatises, what is a science? So um, sometimes it meant that theology as the queen of the sciences establishes the principles that are passed on to every other science as their first principles. And that doesn't hold up, and Torrance rejects that. Um, there are all other kinds of ways that theology as a queen of the sciences
Mm.
can be expressed. Maybe another one is certainty, that in theology we have greater certainty than the other sciences. That one doesn't fly either. Um, the my own my own view is that queen of the sciences is really a, a difficult metaphor to work with,
Yeah.
and I try to apply when that phrase comes up. I'd like to invert it on the basis of the gospel accounts of Jesus saying, whoever is greatest among you will be the servant.
Mm.
So my argument would be, if we want to see whether there's some sense in which we can still say theology is the queen of the sciences, if that is the case, then it will be proven if theology is able to show that it can successfully serve all of the other sciences in helping them to achieve their scientific aims. And that gets to that dialogue. Does theology have the ability to really dialogue with every other science in
Yeah.
a mutually beneficial, respectful way? I think
And
so.
would that be something that we would say that systems thinking, as Torrance would imply that James Clerk Maxwell took his theology, came up with scientific theory that, in a sense, informed the nature of thinking in a field theory kind of way, that there's a servant viewing of the world that allows for insight that then becomes helpful for others? Would that be an example of that?
Yeah, but we have to be really careful not to legislate.
right?
So so for example, in various places in Torrance's writing, he's identifying principles in theology that are relevant to other fields of
Uh-huh.
science, such as contingent order, for example, or whatever. And and the and I think I find it more helpful to talk about those principles resonating.
Hmm.
And one of the examples for this I actually put in the handout when Georges Lemaitre was cautioning the Pope not to take the Big Bang as a basis for, as the Christian view of cosmology. That the Big Bang appeared so congenial compared to, say, Newtonian cosmology for various reasons, including contingent order. The Pope's initial response was to say, "Oh, this modern science has given us a new and Christian cosmology." And Lemaitre, who was a devout Christian and saw all these affinities and resonances with Christian faith, nevertheless wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be identified as the same. So contingent order in Big Bang cosmology should not just be identified with the theological principle. They're very close, but one arises from within the area of scientific investigation. The other arises within theology, and they have a real resonance, so there's room to dialogue, but it's not like one had to be a Christian in order
Hmm.
to come to that view within cosmology. That view was developed cataphyson on its own terms in the science of cosmology. It didn't need the injection of the principle from Christian theology. But but on the other hand, it didn't hurt that Lemaitre was a Christian and therefore had no revulsion or some filter that would cause him to resolve contingency away. He could be comfortable with contingent order, and that gave him perhaps more freedom to actually really be a cosmologist and and let the field um, uh, develop as on its own ground. Does that make sense?
As we get going, you're recognizing that there are many sciences, but the ability to work together of those sciences to not be competitive, but rather to learn is part of the attitude, and Torrance is wanting theology to be part of that as well.
Exactly. He's wanting theology to have a seat at the table of all the sciences, to be part of that conversation in a mutually respectful dialogue. Bruce has put in, did Queen of the Sciences point to the superiority of theology as an integrating discipline, or did it point to the beauty of theology as the primary avenue for seeing God? That latter is definitely true, and that's what I was trying to get at, or I think Torrance is getting at here. Theology is devoted to seeing God and the beauty, the beatific vision. How do we really see God? And since that's the supreme goal of life, then in that sense, we could say theology is the queen of the sciences. But if we start to see theology as lording it over the other sciences, we've gone astray. Better to reframe it in terms of servant of all.
Right. So the short answer, why are other sciences not devoted to the knowledge of God? In each case, those sciences have devoted themselves, Katafusin, to the study of a particular element, which Michael Polanyi in Personal Knowledge would say every scientist chooses their focus, and to not make that a limitation of what others may say, where one dominates. I think that's what you're saying. One science can't dominate the others, and in the best of cases, Torrance is opening up here to say there are many, and each has its proper place, and it is best that they all be in conversation.
Yes, that's right. Um, After it rains, do you go out and look for a rainbow? Maybe this illustration will work. I've not used it before, but um, if you go out and look at the rainbow, you have your back to the sun, right? So the rainbow is beautiful. And And one can look at the sun, and the sun is that's amazing. And without the sun, we don't have the rainbow. But to devote ourselves to the rainbow, we put our back to the rainbow. So it's what we're looking at. Um, I I loved my limnology class, a class on freshwater biology. Isn't that fun to study ponds and streams? Is it are is it appropriate for the Christian to say that the little critters in ponds and streams are worthy of our attention and our understanding? Yes. It's valuing what God has made enough to try to understand them cataphusin.
Hmm.
But we're not trying to understand God by looking at those little fishes.
Yeah.
We're trying to understand the fishes. The fishes are worthy of our attention.
Yeah.
It's important that for all eternity, there are people who will be able to voice those little fishes' praise.
Uh, yeah. No, that's beautiful. And I think, people often see Bart as writing science off, but his concept that all of dogmatics is a scientific work of clarifying our language about who God is and all that God creates. And so when he talks about Jesus is the light that comes into the world, and there are lesser lights, and all of those wouldn't have their being were it not for that light. In a sense, the lesser lights are all of the sciences, what you
Yeah,
just described, the sun and the rainbow, and that there is something we can say not to find God through those lights, but rather to recognize the very being of what all of these lights have find their origin. And the word glory is the word that he uses there. The glory of Christ comes, gives meaning and purpose to salamanders and to
yes.
whales and fjords, and I mean all these things.
Oh, I like your bringing in that passage from Bart. I think that's perfectly apt. And that reminds me of Lewis's famous statement, the quote that's put on his memorial at Westminster Cathedral. I believe in God not because, how does it go? But
I
because,
believe in the sun, not because I see it, but that by it I see everything else. I think
there
is,
you go. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So so if as Christians, we should see within the body of the church, we should see people who want to express their faith, who are called to express their faith by understanding everything in light of their faith. And that means every single science should be a calling for the
Mhm.
Christian. But
Mhm.
they're not going into that field in order to know God. They're going into that field because knowing God, that field now has value, no matter how small it may appear.
But yeah, and faith is not merely kind of an abstract concept. It's a scientific attitude that looks at reality as real with God, made by God to understand how do we understand the purposes and place of all these things,
Right.
right? Because often when you say the word faith, we lose a sense of science. Where to say faith is science and
Yeah.
science is faith that is appropriately engaging the world and finding trustworthy understanding, participation within it.
Yes. Faith, trustworthy understanding. Absolutely. Right on.
Your second point, a quote, theological way of thinking, not from a center in ourselves, but from a center in God. And you ask the question, is it true that in every science we must think not from a center in ourselves, but from a center in the object of that science?
I love that phrase that Torrance uses in so many of his books, that we're to think from a center in God, in theology, calling us not to project ourselves onto God, but it's kind of shorthand for the cataphysin approach in science.
Mhm.
And yeah, I just wanted us to remember that's true in every field.
Yeah,
We want to be centered in the object of that science.
yeah.
Aristotle, back in the posterior analytics and other places, had the same distinction, and or what I take to be the same distinction. And he said there are two ways of knowing something. One is according to us, and that's the way of the learner, where we go from what's familiar to what's unfamiliar. And that's important for teaching. We start where we are. And that's validated by the incarnation. God comes to us. And our doctrine of creation is that reality is so powerful, it will come to us. It's an actor.
Mhm.
But but what we're trying to do is move from that. We start off that way, but we constantly want to be moving to knowing the thing as on its own principles.
Mhm.
So so Aristotle's arguing we don't actually achieve knowledge of a thing until we're able to explain it by according to its nature.
Yeah.
And so this whole idea of cataphysin, I believe, is rooted in this ancient conversation begun by Aristotle about how we move from understanding things according to a center in ourselves, and we move eventually as we grow in that field to understanding them from a center in the object of knowledge.
Yeah.
And for theology, that's God discloses God, and we don't project ourselves onto God.
Yeah. And the nature of the center of the self. I'm just reminded in my head of the tour guides in Estonia, in Denmark, in Sweden who said, "We are the most unreligious country in the world," right? And
Uh-huh.
there was a kind of pride that we have centered in ourself and no longer
Mhm.
go with religious ways of thinking that are outside of ourself. And there's a sense in which they just lost the value of what Torrance is trying to get in here, that there's the finding of meaning in this life that God presents outside of ourselves, that when we lose that, you collapse into a kind of individualism, which means that everybody's looking out for themselves and not for either who God is or who our neighbor is. And so it's a profoundly practical cultural loss. I think Mike Hobbits has said in New Zealand, it's apathy. They're not proud that they're not religious. They just don't care. Right. And so, these are all forms of losing this scientific attitude that recognizes the value of what it is that theological science brings to center humanity with purpose and meaning and connection, that provides the inquiry, the curiosity into all of the sciences at some level.
Mhm.
So theological thinking impacts I think it impacts our curiosity, which is
Yeah,
part of the theological component there, right?
that's right. Yeah. Oh my goodness. How can we be interested in God and not be curious about all that He has made? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the whole idea of centering, I mean, that's about having an appropriate focus on where we place our questions, right?
hmm And drawing our principles from God Himself in
Right,
theology, or drawing our principles from whatever field we're studying.
right.
It, if I'm going to study, uh, it, well, pick your science. You're not going to take your principles from some other science.
Though you may learn from them to see things you hadn't otherwise seen.
Right. But they're going to have to be grounded. To appropriate them means grounding them in the science you're in,
Yeah,
not just transferring them over
right,
uncritically.
right. So your third point, theology interacts with every science. And this is what you said of Torrance, that he has this broad sense of engagement. So, quote, theological science is not therefore a special science in the sense to which all the other sciences, special sciences, are bracketed off in their own specialization. So you've got six questions underneath this. So walk us through a little bit about what it is that you want to get at, because we're really clarifying now what we mean by the subject of this chapter, the special sciences and the place of theology within it.
Yeah, I do love that chapter, and that goes to that hypothesis I suggested at the beginning that I think this is Torrance's real vision, and oftentimes what he calls natural theology is misunderstood because we tend to have the usual understanding of natural theology as a foundational exercise where we're reasoning from science or from philosophy to God. And
Mhm.
I think Torrance had a different tradition and a different understanding of natural theology, where it meant this conversation, this mutually beneficial dialogue between theology and the other sciences. So, So to me, this is a really key theme in Torrance, and it's what I find so inspiring as a historian of science in reading Torrance is the light he throws on this in all of his works, not just this one. What is meant by special science? I think that's a special science is one that is restricted in its scope to a particular area of investigation. So take take astronomy as an example, maybe. Um, Astronomy doesn't study the function of the heart within our body. That's those are two different sciences that would be involved: the human biology or physiology and astronomy. On the other hand, certain aspects of astronomy, as we study them, might actually join up with the physics of the very small, and a new science would emerge of astrophysics that combines the very large and the very small. That changing configuration of sciences is what makes the study of the history of science so fascinating to me. So the sciences aren't just a priori um, defined in an ideal sense. They emerge over time as these connections between questions and subject areas uh, show an interrelation. But nevertheless, a special science is something that is restricted. You've got to show that that the questions you're pursuing are internally connected by nature in some way.
Tom deals with special science, then distinguishing it from general science in chapter 3. Where he places them together and says you cannot have a special science that is unscientific to all the other sciences in general. It's unique in its own way. There's certain fidelities that the practitioners must keep to, and as you pointed out, a point after which they just need to stop. But Tom tries to make the point over and over again is you cannot have special sciences without having a great deal of sense about what is science generally, and you cannot have a sense of what is science generally without immediately jumping to the special sciences, the sciences spatiale, because that is how all science is done, distinctly within its specialties. It's a hermeneutical question, but that it really needs to be repeated over and over and over again. That every scientist knows with humility that they are specialists in one particular area and maybe two, but all the other areas they are as much of a generalist as everyone else.
Yeah.
And their main thing then is to be humble. And to occasionally, he will point out that occasionally they will need to correct and say, when you said that, you kind of stepped over, you blurred a line there. You might want to back that up and try again.
Oh, thank you so much for jumping in. You said more eloquently than I did something I was trying to say earlier, so thank you.
And the other side of the coin of humility is respect. It's humility for
Yeah.
self and respect that the others have something to say that needs to be listened to.
So these points about brackets, I had not realized that Tom had been criticized for bracketing off, which I bracket things off all the time. It's the only way I get anything done. I cannot study every problem everywhere all the time. I must study this problem in this way with these specialists for a while and then close brackets. It's the only way I make any progress.
Absolutely. I do think that's what he means by bracketing.
Oh, yeah.
I think when he's been criticized on the bracketing language, it's been misread in a couple ways. One is that people have read him as in light of debates over methodological naturalism. And so they've tended to think, oh my goodness, he's selling out to methodological naturalism. And he's just defining these questions differently in a much more productive way. I think the whole debates over methodological naturalism are in foundationally they are not well construed and would learn from this book how to better approach the relations of the sciences. Um, and and then bracketing has also been raised in the questions of, for those criticizing Torrance for falling into a natural theology, being inconsistent in his um, affirmation of Barth. And I think that also is a misreading of the language of bracketing. I think what you said, Kenneth, is exactly correct.
There's a nature in your fourth point that authority can become contentious as to who has the authority to make claims about what is science, where there's a nature of Polanyi's Society of Explorers, where we're all explorers and we each bring our explorations, our questions to one another so that we can together explore, where there's both the Katafusin, but also there's the conversation of the community that goes on. So you have a bracket, but it's permeable and necessarily engages the others so that everyone is improved in their investigative journey.
Yeah. On that question of authority, one of the classic ones that we all ought to familiarize ourselves with is in the Galileo affair, where to a large degree physics had the authority in the sciences and mathematics was considered a subordinate science. Um, the physicists who were not trained in mathematics were the ones who were given authority and competence to answer such questions as, is the moon perfectly smooth in its surface? Does the is the earth at the center of the cosmos? These were questions to be answered through logic in the discipline of physics, and the mathematicians were just supposed to provide calculations, not truth. And so the debate over Copernicanism was largely a debate over the scope of authority that should be given to these emerging mathematical sciences, where the mathematicians were saying we can address the questions those physicists address, and we can do it more powerfully and with greater certainty and reliability than the physicists. And the result over 100 years was physics becoming mathematical. So the mathematicians won. And yet the trouble was that the theologians who were also trained in physics, some of them, like the Jesuits, were from the beginning also trained in mathematics, so they were more open. But when the physicists were trained, I'm sorry, when the theologians were trained in physics but not mathematics, they tended to uncritically merge theology and physics. And so they missed the developing capacity of mathematics to address these questions in cosmology. It was a question of authority. Yes, Young
And
Il?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised, though, because Galileo certainly was using math to describe the laws of motion. But wouldn't you say that by the time Newton come along, he had to develop new math in order to do the physics, right? Calculus was invented or created so that he could describe the gravity, and planetary motion. So at that point in time, even math was being created alongside development of physics.
Oh, no doubt. I really appreciate that. So mathematics was in a form of tremendous development, uh, and the calculus is a perfect example. But it was also in development in the late medieval and early modern periods. So, um, and in a way caught the theologians and the physicists off guard. And and there's a social component to this as well. When Galileo was at the had his position at the University of Padua, physicists were paid 3 times what mathematicians were paid.
Hmm.
And when he brought the telescope in and demonstrated it to the Venetian Senate, and they doubled his salary and gave him tenure, he was still making far less than the physicists at Padua. So, you want to go for truth, you go to the physicists in cosmology. Uh, it's sometimes said that the mathematicians were instrumentalists. They were just out to save the phenomena, but those are the physicists talking. The mathematicians were realists, and they believed that their mathematical techniques were showing them through the harmony of the universe as expressed in by Copernicus himself. They were realists and thought that that required the Earth to be traveling around the sun. It wasn't greater predictive capacity that persuaded them that Copernicus was true. It was the harmony, the music of the sphere's tradition, the mathematical criteria of elegance and harmony that proved to them the Earth is moving. And the physicists would have none of that at this time because they were not yet trained in physics. But by the time you get to Newton, it's changing, and in that physicists are having to learn mathematics.
The relationship between mathematics describing physical reality and the math of geometry in describing physics. There was a sloppiness there in the physicists would, if they saw that something was round, it was always round, it was perfectly round, and it could not be anything else, it could not change. It's shared in the eternity of geometry. Whereas there is no real eternity of mathematics. It describes motion. It describes change. I think there was something of the competition there, and it was back to Galileo. When people began evoking Queen of the Sciences on Galileo, it was in order to say, Galileo, shut up. The Queen of the Sciences has spoken. And she says, you're wrong. And the church teaches what the Queen of the Sciences says. That, to your point, it inverted the authority so badly that after 1 or 2 generations, they let the whole thing collapse. And then it all went down over the Reformation.
One of you all may know of Guy Consolmagno. He's now retired, but until just recently was the director of the Vatican Observatory. And he's a Jesuit, as the Jesuits have always run the Vatican Observatory. They were the leading scientific society, one might argue, in the 17th century. Certainly before the Royal Society of London, they organized scientific work around the world, and they were all trained in mathematics. And as a result, the Jesuits were initially very sympathetic to Galileo. They saw they appreciated the power of these emerging mathematical disciplines, and uh, Brother Guy has a very disarming way of, as a Jesuit, when he's asked to speak on Galileo, which he has all his career, but he will usually begin his talk on Galileo. I've heard it several times, and it's wonderful. You can find it on YouTube. Watch him. He will say, um, everything you've heard about Galileo and the church is wrong, but the truth doesn't make the church look any better. Now, that's a wonderful, wonderful hook to bring people in. The way I like to do it, a similar statement that I like to throw out to have people doubt the common caricatures that have been passed down is that this is a like throwing a little throwing something out for discussion, but it's a provocation to thinking. Some of Galileo's strongest supporters were in the church, and some of Galileo's strongest opponents were in the universities. And by the former, I mean the Jesuits, and by the latter, I mean the physicists. So the theologians who were not Jesuits, who were not trained in mathematics, did not appreciate the capabilities of these emerging methods of the mathematicians and just regarded them as calculators. And they trusted the physicists as being the sure guide to truth. But there were plenty in the church who were on the side of the mathematicians. And this is this translates to the question for all of us when disciplines are in a constant state of change, as the history of science shows that they are. There's not one static configuration of sciences. Most emerging research fronts are incipient new sciences being created, and there's a kind of braided stream, and the water's constantly shifting back and forth. And as we look at the sciences that are emerging, the challenge for theologians and for those in neighboring sciences is not to just dismiss the methods of the emerging fields. So that takes real discipline to stay with the cataphysin approach in every field and keep it open-ended so that we appreciate when these new areas open up that haven't been investigated as well as we maybe thought they were. When new methodologies emerge, are we going to be the last to recognize the validity of those new methods? Hopefully not. That's where theological mistakes like the condemnation of Galileo came from. Against her better lights, the church sided with the physicists against the mathematicians in Galileo's generation.
I want to pick up your question there just by going back. The question, how does the one God ground theology in a distinctive wholeness and unity? Theology engages all of these things in the church with people who maintain a sense there is one God about whom we speak. And so whether we're doing mathematics or physics, there is a sense of serving this one God, therefore serving the world and our place within it. And the nature of bracketing off isn't walls, is what I hear you say, which kind of would lead to the last question. Do you think theology can find ways to dialogue? So bracket doesn't mean wall. There is a sense of awareness. The idea that fences make good neighbors isn't to keep them out, it's to keep the cows out of my garden. And we both work on building the wall so that we're each aware of and respective of each other's spaces. And so I think that's kind of part of what's going on there. You mentioned this article that you've linked us to regarding bracketed off. Did you want to say something about that? What pot of gold is there?
Yeah, if you want to go to that chapter of Ground and Grammar, which I think has a lot of connection and overlap with this chapter, Marty, you invited me to be the guest when we were discussing that chapter, and so my handout there has a lot more on the way I understand about Torrance's conception of the relations between the sciences,
Right.
and how that's his idea of natural theology, but it's not what it's not a foundationalist natural theology of as I was saying before.
Yeah. Good. And so your last question in that one, do you think theology can find ways to dialogue? And again, Torrance's theology is not like all theologies. So we do have theologians today who are they're committed to, a kind of a systematic system that puts up walls and barriers and doesn't enter into the dynamic of what we call the scientific method as Torrance is laying it out here. So the question, what does it mean to be a scientific theologian, is really at stake there. Can we be scientific in our theology to the point that we can live in conversations where we resonate in these conversations? And I think you've been representing that throughout here.
Yeah. And just on a practical level, that means valuing the scientists that you know in your life and listening to them and getting them to share with you
Mhm.
what makes them excited about their work. And the more we can understand those in any science, the natural sciences, but also other sciences,
Mhm.
the it, it, it the more we're understanding the all the potential, all the intelligibility that God has put into the creation.
Did you want to say something, Bruce?
Yeah, I suppose it's going back just a little bit, but it was Kerry talking about the physicists versus the mathematicians in relation to Galileo. And I suppose just to clarify in my own mind, when Galileo put forward his theory and his mathematics, was a persuasive power for those who are persuaded? Was it purely in the elegance and the beauty of the system, or was it because it related to a fundamental reality in the universe, i.e., gravity? In other words, gravity demanded that the mathematical system be obeyed or be acknowledged, rather than just the mathematics providing a much simpler and more beautiful system.
Well, that's a wonderful question, Bruce. We could we could act on that quite a bit. My initial response would be from a historical perspective, the harmonies were of the sort that the motions of the planets were interlinked in a beautiful way in the Copernican models, um, so that the idea of gravity that I hear you articulating is a later concept. So later on, it could be understood that way. But at the time, the way reality was presenting itself already in this incipient way, unfinished, open-ended way, it was still um, it was still based on the idea of harmony and elegance and proportion in integrating the mathematical models for the planets. But it was subtle enough that it took a mathematician to be able to discern that beauty. And so Galileo had other factors in mind as well. There were astrological arguments in favor of Copernicanism that were very powerful for Galileo. He created horoscopes for friends. He was involved in a culture that took astrology seriously. Those arguments are powerful and important. He historically, he was very much concerned about those crazy Protestants up north, especially the Lutherans, who have this matter theory where even matter has activity to it. These hidden forces acting at a distance, like Kepler's gravitational theory for the tides. We can't, if we believe that, he told the Pope, we're going to have all this natural magic stuff just come out of the woodwork. So a Catholic understanding of nature needs to be stripped down to matter and motion. And thus, in Galileo's dialogue on the two chief systems of the world, the largest portion is given over to his argument for the motion of the earth from the tides as an alternative to Kepler's theory, gravitational theory of the tides. And there are other things as well that played into Galileo's own arguments. But so the way you framed it makes a lot of sense, especially after Newton or even more later in retrospect. Yeah, but but historically, what was open to him, what's interesting to me is that even historically, the argument from mathematics was the chief, um, what was chiefly the powerful one. And and that's what's mistaken. That's what's missed by people who just assume that Copernicus had a lot of predictions he could make that the Earth-centered models couldn't, which is false. And uh, the models were equivalent. Kepler even criticized Copernicus for trying to just be equivalent to Ptolemy, not better than Ptolemy.
So if we just sort of think further along that line, Kerry, I mean, it wasn't that people went to the stake because something was more beautiful than the alternative. But once we bring in the later developed concept of gravity, what we're saying is that the logic of the science, i.e., the mathematics, is actually driven by a fundamental force underneath which drives that logic. And I suppose if we transfer that to theology, we can say that the logic of theology has to be driven by a fundamental force or a fundamental reality underneath, which creates it, which gives it certain qualities, and which enables it in turn to be driven into different areas of faith and life. But ultimately, you have to go to something which is solid, which is real, which is dynamic, which then creates the logic by which we think through that reality or that science that we're dealing with.
Oh, Bruce, I appreciate you explaining that. I get that and agree. Um, as long as one isn't bringing some of those words anachronistically into the Copernican Galilean world. What I made the comment about astrology, and I would say astrology actually fulfilled much of that purpose in providing an understanding of reality so that the mathematics was growing out of reality. The mathematics of the rotating spheres was not because of some idea of geometry existing on its own in an eternal way. The rotating spheres were understood as real physical bodies that affect the changes that are beneath the moon. And, and so astrology, as practiced in the Islamic world and as it had come over into early modern period, that was it was an attempt to understand the physical reality of the universe in motion. And that's certainly at the heart of what Copernicus was doing. It wasn't some abstract love of circles, as used to be said 50 years ago or something. So that would be the analog, I think. By the way, I'm not aware of any person who went to the stake for a sun-centered Copernican model. Just to throw that in there too.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily meaning that literally.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll take it very metaphorically. Bruno is the example everybody gives, but he denied the Trinity. We actually happen to have one of the extant manuscripts of his on the errors of the Trinity in the collections, but it was for that and other heresies, not for his science, that he was um, put to death.
The
Not
particular kind
died.
of scientific issue, as we're talking about it here, to get the Trinity wrong does have the science of theology amiss. So he did go for scientific miscalculation.
Oh, it's sad. It's a sad story. Yeah.
Yes. So just moving on a bit, maybe
Oh, let me just throw out, since I mentioned astrology and the mathematicians like
yes.
Copernicus and Galileo being realists, not idealists in some sense, but realists in their mathematic approach to mathematics. The most important work on Copernicus in the last half century is by Robert Westman, and it's called the Copernican something. Gosh, what's the name of it? Um, the Copernican question, I think might be it. Let me see. Yeah, the Copernican question. If you want Up-to-date scholarship on Copernicus start with the Copernican question by Westman, and that takes you right into the realist basis of the mathematics in Copernicus and in Galileo. Less Kepler's all on his own. He's separate.
Very good.
I'm a little bit confused. Maybe I missed the first half hour, but when you say realist basis of mathematics, do you mean that math is actually describing reality?
Yes.
That math comes out of reality, or
Yes, that
okay.
as opposed to the idea that mathematics is a unique way into metaphysical truths that are prior to the reality of what actually exists.
So this is opposed to a Platonic view of math.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good.
Thanks for that question. Good question.
Very good. So I think we've talked a little bit about the Queen of Sciences, and at one level, there is a battle in sciences over who has the power. Today, the question, has science proved this, as part of that battle? And so theology is not an empowered science. For Torrance, as he's going through here, there's a sense in which the servant place of theology to enable a knowledge of the living God and for the church to live in the light of that and to bring that into the world. The servant role of the sciences might be a better way of dealing with that. And it's in this section that he discusses also contingency, on 283. As we have seen, by its doctrine of God and creation theology acknowledges the full place of other sciences as independent branches of knowledge of contingent reality. So here's your point. But whenever these special sciences seek to unify and extend their knowledge of contingent processes beyond the boundary of what is creaturely contingent and relative, claiming to be the one and only way of penetrating into the ultimate secrets of the universe, or at least of being able to test theological knowledge for its truth, falsity, then theology cannot but come into conflict with them. So this whole question of where this chapter is going, where there is conflict, it is because of a wrestling with, who's king of the mountain instead of how do we best serve God and humanity.
I'm glad you read that quote, Marty. That's a good one and a powerful one. Yeah, this is really central that Torrance isn't, we're not reading him like Stephen Jay Gould's book on science and religion, where he talked about religion and science as being separate magisteria, that
Yeah.
they're non-overlapping. They That's so close to being true, or so close to being what Torrance is affirming when he's saying all the special sciences overlap only a little, and we don't want to illegitimately appropriate or make an incursion upon their authority. But that doesn't mean they can't conflict, because as someone put in as Bruce put in the comments, Maxwell would insist that each science must face up to the metaphysical questions which that discipline raises. And so there are, within every science, questions are raised that science cannot answer. And so the scientist has the temptation of just trying to barrel through and answer them. We hear on all the time on TV, some scientist is willing to address a question that is properly raised in their science, but to discuss it immediately takes them outside the bounds of that science.
Mm,
And maybe they need to call upon a philosopher or a theologian to dialogue with them, or someone from a neighboring science.
mm,
And so this particular example where Torrance is pointing out that the special sciences deal with contingent realities, the whole temptation that Torrance, in many of his works, including here, he emphasizes how one of the ways that theology can help the other sciences is by encouraging them to not have to resolve contingencies away. So if I'm faced with any aspect of contingent order that might have been otherwise than it is, the the temptation to me is that of Aristotle, who said that proper knowledge must be causal and it must consist of invoke necessary causes. So we know why this was necessary and had to be the way it is. And if we don't know that it had to be the way it is, we don't understand it yet. So to Aristotle and to many who adopted his model of knowledge, knowledge only applies to things that are necessary. And when Christians come along and are talking about the incarnation and then after that creatio ex nihilo and all the other things, we have to affirm reality that is not necessary. It could have been otherwise. At least it's not necessary within a creaturely frame. That nature didn't contain its own necessity in the way it has developed.
Mhm.
And and so that is one of the tremendous gifts that Christian theology offers scientists in any field is you don't have to resolve all contingency away. We don't have to go back to Aristotle's model of what knowledge is. And one perfect example of that is the Big Bang, as I brought up earlier, where the temptation for so many cosmologists is is to come up with a way around the contingency of the universe, that to try to come up with an explanation for the Big Bang, even though that time, space, causality all break down. So it's going beyond the science of cosmology to do this, but it's raising the question of what's beyond the Big Bang because the scientist just is so uncomfortable with a limit that is that 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 the scientist bumps up against within the science, and the scientist wants to resolve that limit away because it's contingent. And Christian theology can say no, it's appropriate for us to recognize and accept the contingent character of natural order. And if we bump up against that in our science, that may be an actual aspect of nature. Uh, if we can get beyond it, great, but we don't have to because their contingency is real. So while a Christian wouldn't say the Big Bang is the Christian view of cosmology, a Christian should say the contingent order revealed by the Big Bang is very congenial to Christian theology, and we can accept that element of contingency in it. Does that make sense in illustrating this?
Does quantum confuse all that or give them an excuse to say Big Bang's not the beginning?
Well, for Stephen Hawking, he was looking for a quantum theory of the universe that would resolve the contingency of the Big Bang away. So,
Yeah.
so it probably depends on the person. Different cosmologists will have different levels of comfort with the limits of contingent order. And of course, if successful, I wouldn't want to get in the trap of saying the Big Bang has to be correct. It's not the Christian view, but just the fact that it has a limit to our understanding because there's contingent order involved, that to the Christian should not be a red flag. That may be the nature of reality because we know in many ways reality is contingent order. It's not necessary order.
Hmm.
And Hawking used to say in his earlier years, he was looking for an equation of the universe that would be so compelling that it
Yeah.
would call the universe into existence. And when he used the phrase mind of God, he meant the necessary order of the universe. So he had a lifelong quest to prove that cosmology could be understood in terms of necessary causes,
Mm.
this aversion to contingent order.
Mm.
And so I think in this passage you read, Marty, we could plug in Torrance's book, Divine and Contingent Order, as amplifying what he's saying here. There really is a place where if the cosmologist takes it upon himself to say there can be no contingent order, all order must be necessary, then that cosmologist has ceased to be speaking as a cosmologist. They're a cosmologist following a question raised in cosmology, but now they're pontificating as a metaphysician or a theologian.
Yeah, I was thinking of Brian Cox, if you've heard of him. Yeah,
I'm not a
Brian Cox,
yeah,
COX.
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to press on just so we can finish here. The question of number 5, does theology stand to benefit from respectful dialogue with special sciences? I mean, that's an obvious yes, I think, from everything we're saying. Everybody wins when there's an openness to learn and to become communities of learners who share and are open to learning and being questioned and questioning, pressing on together, katafusin, so that the ultimate authority is reality itself and not any member of the community. Number 6, no direct comparison between theological science and the special sciences is possible, only a comparison of relations. Can you say something about that?
Let's not have any superficial transfer of conclusions from one science to another.
Okay. Allow for their distinctiveness. Okay. And then the last one on that page, indirect comparison may serve what kind of purpose? And by indirect comparison, what is meant there?
The comparison of relations. So relations within one science might give us a model for relations within another science. I really liked his point that if we're communicating, for example, how how theology deals with a question like objectivity, for example, that might actually have a parallel in some other science.
Mm-hmm.
And so for other sciences to see how theology has worked out the problem in its own ground might be an inspiration and a model for working it out in another science. It also gains intellectual sympathy for theology as a science. We want to be in setting theological science and other sciences in juxtaposition so that practitioners of other sciences can see that theologians are wrestling with some of the same questions, same issues, and we have common problems that we can talk about. I think a perfect example of that is Torrance's friendship with Michael Polanyi. And we can learn so much from their overlap, how to conduct, how the work of the theologian can be made of interest to the work of a natural scientist.
So I married a dentist who's concerned about hygiene, and so I bring the image of teeth both with one another as well as the upper and lower sets of teeth as a metaphor for human relations, the science of the personal. She gets upset with that. She says, they're not the same thing. It's like, but there is a borrowing of ideas of one that I think are helpful for the others. And actually, the nature of the way that they go, there's what's called a centric relation. There's a point at which you have to figure out when it's working, that they actually fit together well, which, Christ as the centric relation
I like
is
that.
a very interesting image. So that's a whole book that I have to write on the nature of dentistry as a metaphor for human relations, both within when you marry, that's another set of teeth that you're engaging. And so anyway, I think there's something there of what you're just saying, that we borrow images and it helps us to see something we couldn't otherwise. The idea came to me one day when the hygienist was cleaning my teeth, and she said, "You know why I'm taking out between your gums?" It's like, I guess I don't. Well, I have to get all the gunk out of the way so that the gum can adhere to the tooth. And if it doesn't, they separate and your teeth fall out. And I was like, oh, that's the work of relationships, getting the stuff out of the way that gets under our skin, so to speak, and we don't talk about it and it becomes problematic. And that just got me thinking, and it just has kept playing out. So
All right.
Again, just to say that's a borrowing of images from one that it's not identical, and yet it opens up the capacity for discovery.
Mhm.
When I was in Edinburgh, Tom was thrashing about with the book, The Tao of Physics. It
Yes.
just come out. And everybody was saying, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? He says, well, this may be an example of where somebody, in order to allow for a certain spirituality within the science of physics, is using an Eastern mysticism, which doesn't do very well for physics or for Eastern mysticism, because they don't share enough common logics. I look for lack of a better word. It just said somebody had asked me about that, and I said, no, I don't think that'll work. I don't think that Einstein or anyone would be very interested in that, or would have been very interested in that. And that was a case of overstepping bounds in what they thought was a helpful way of overcoming or trying to heal the gap between materialist technological understanding of physics and a more spiritual and humanistic understanding of physics. He said he thought it was a failure, but I just checked, and the book is still in print.
Oh, yeah.
They have a 30th anniversary edition. Oh.
Okay. I'm going to page 2. Similarities. We're in the second part of this chapter, the similarities between theology and other sciences. So we've done an introduction. We've recognized the value of the conversation of the varieties of sciences and that theology has a place within it. So now he has 5 points that he wants to outline for us of similarities between theology and the other sciences. So point 1, just say a bit about point 1 there, Kerry.
This one we probably don't need to spend a lot of time on because I think it's recapitulating what's been talked about throughout the book, that theology is a human inquiry. And so, as with any science, there's going to be assumptions about the existence, intelligibility of the object, the Catafusan approach, according to, in a manner appropriate to its own nature. The models or cognitive tools are going to be developed, and I've used the term semantic realism to try to capture what Torrance is Torrance's realism. I know you've had Travis on, and so just plug in all your previous discussions about
Yeah.
method. Um, I, I I think he's in a mode of summary there.
The use of the word windows was interesting to me. At Seattle Pacific University, I taught 3 foundations courses: Christian scripture, Christian theology, and Christian spirituality. And I described it to some students that, if you have a window, here's where the window metaphor comes in. The structure of the window is biblical studies. We need it there to see that there's something there. We see through the window, that is doing theological work. We understand the nature of God made available through the window. And when it gets dark outside, the window becomes a mirror. And so we can see ourselves in the light of what is there in a way. And that's where Christian spirituality is a reflection on the nature of what is there in that. And so there's something about the structure of a window for that just gave me a sense of kind of 3 different sciences within Christian disciplines. Does that resonate at all with the use of the word windows that he used it here? Because he
Oh
didn't use
yeah,
that in text.
I think that's great. Thanks, Marty. Yeah,
Okay, good. Because there's different things that one can pay attention to, and that paying attention is, in a sense, the different disciplines at work, right?
yeah, yeah. And I will say this, I'm trying to speak to you as a historian of science.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not a professional theologian or anything like that, but I think one of the reasons that people like studying the history of science is it is that no one would find the history of science interesting if one had a positivist understanding of scientific method. If science really is just accumulating observations and making generalizations, and you know who would ever want to read the history of science? But if so, as soon as we start to get a historical breadth to our look at science, we're bringing into view how the how the how major figures really were seeking contact with a full reality of the universe.
Mhm.
And they were almost always realists in this sense, looking past the the words, looking past the equations, looking past the models to try to comprehend the universe itself.
Mhm.
And this semantic realism really comes out as a major theme in scientific episodes of the past when we get that stereoscopic view of history.
Mhm. Point one, in a sense, is Polanyi's all knowledge is personal knowledge. And so it's just to recognize that the sciences all need to not think that there's something that's so objective that the personal is lost, but to say that the nature of theology and all sciences is always going to be a human function. Trees don't do it, animals don't do it, the world doesn't do it. Only humans do science, and theology is one of those sciences. So the second one, respect for objectivity, is just the nature of, we are studiers and there's something there. Objectivity is there's really something there that we're studying. And so the use of the word reason is the something that is there. And maybe the word it's orderly. Does objectivity and orderliness of what is there also bear what is similar between theology and the other sciences?
Yes, I like that. Right. And then Torrance's point here that I think really it calls us to recognize that theology gives us a religious obligation for objectivity in theology and in sciences. So if anybody ought to be standing for rigorous objectivity in science, it's theologians.
Mm.
And and as a result, we should expect in our churches
Mhm.
many young people to be interested in the sciences.
Mhm. We should encourage it. It should be a
Yeah,
component. And to
yeah,
say at one point, hospitals and as I understand it, the development of civilization, monasteries went and they learned to plant fields and
yeah.
to build and all kinds of things, that was the theological impulse that
That's right.
provided and served communities, that was the growth of civilization itself at some level.
Yes,
So that's a model of the objective placement of theological thinkers in a way that serve the world.
right.
Point three, then, metaphysics arises after the fact a posteriori.
Yeah. This one, I really appreciated the way he brought this out. And, there's so many details here probably for us than we can pursue, but his point um, that the metaphysics develops within a science from the ground of that science. It's not an independent discipline that exists a priori before that science and and guides that science from above. And that's the way metaphysics used to be talked about in the mid 20th century. Books like E.A. Burt's The Metaphysics of Modern Science, showing that metaphysics against the positivist, showing that metaphysics is actually really a part of science. That's true, but tending to think of metaphysics as the presuppositions of science. And that's not always the case. We enter science with presuppositions, but the scientific field itself can refine, critique, and shape the metaphysical um, principles that arise from that. And and with metaphysics, think especially about in the next sub bullet point, I say presupposed ontological ideas regarding space, time, logic, causation, natural law. Anytime you see words like that, then we're talking metaphysics and how are those words really being defined and understood in that science? And and um, Torrance's point that we don't just take those from philosophy and insert them in science and require science to to define those terms according to the way they were developed in philosophy. I think is pretty radical and it's really important. It also goes against the stream of when Torrance was writing. When Torrance was writing, many people approached metaphysics as its own field that would dictate to the sciences how they had to act and how they had to define their terms. And Torrance is saying no. And he's saying no in large part with the example of Barth, but out of the the realization that to protect theology as a science, theology cannot allow philosophy, some field of philosophy called metaphysics, to tell it how to define space, time, cause, law, etc. Those terms that need to be developed in theology on its own grounds, developed in physics, geology, biology, whatever, they all of these fields will work with these terms, raising these metaphysical issues, joining in the conversation about metaphysics. But metaphysics needs to become more, uh, maybe we could think of it as more democratized. All the sciences need to be in conversation about these metaphysical questions. They all have a voice and they don't dictate for the others. The philosophers are part of that conversation too. I'm not meaning to diss them, but they need to come back down to earth and realize that questions of metaphysics need to be grounded in each particular science.
In the
So,
1970s, his particular bête noire was Alfred North Whitehead. And he said Whitehead came up with a theory of relativity, and Einstein came up with a theory of relativity. Who won that argument? And that, as a theologian adjacent to physics, he was criticizing an attempt to use a metaphysical concept in physics that he didn't think worked, either in physics or in theology. And he was quite willing to throw that out there and demonstrate how one way we can all be allies in a general clarifying of all of our thinking, but in that clarification, Whitehead needed to be pushed to one side.
yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Whitehead is a perfect example. The book by Burt that I mentioned, Torrance quotes as well. There were, the part of all the debates about the role of Christianity in the emergence of modern science often headed off in the direction of the metaphysics of modern science. But again, what Torrance is doing that's so helpful is saying the metaphysics is not a priori. Don't let it put any science in a straitjacket. And I think that was really salutary of Torrance, um, given the people he was interacting with at the time.
Would you say that the word metaphysics, I'm thinking out of John McMurray here, in interpreting the universe, he says, we
Mhm.
act in the world, and because we act, we then reflect. And our reflections become something that allows us then to act again in light of the reality that we've engaged. And so the thinking, reasoning that is developed, and we do it as communities, is our capacity to engage the world because it's teaching us, so to speak, as we act, reflect, the rhythm of withdrawal and return, he calls that in The Self as Agent. So the nature of metaphysics for me, it's always a little bit hard to get my head around, but it's like if we're a community of reflection who gather our thoughts together to better live in the interaction with the world, and who God is, revealed in the person of Christ, is part of that. The act of God allows us to act as those who are participating in what God's doing. Then we are humans who are coming to learn. We are allowing ourselves to be taught in our act in the world, and because God has acted towards us. So the a posteriori, it's the faith of simply acknowledging the reality of that which we have acted in relationship with, so that our thoughts and gathered understanding appropriately acts in light of reality. He uses the word universe in the kind of holistic sense that Torrance uses it. Does that work, that metaphysic and the reflective life of a community, does that parallel?
Oh, I like that. I would love to see more and more Torrance scholars read your work, Marty, on McMurray And I hope you haven't written your last article on McMurray and
Oh, I'm
Torrance.
just getting going.
Oh, okay, good. Because I think it would be really helpful to have some people write articles on metaphysics in so and so and Torrance to show him in dialogue with the various understandings of metaphysics
Yeah,
in the 20th century.
yeah,
This is not very well explored, in my opinion.
yeah,
Metaphysics was in many cases um, coming out of Kantian philosophy, uh, the Catholic revival of a neo-Thomist theology, but also the native Scottish intellectual tradition of realism from the common sense realists, William Hamilton, others, McMurray, and 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 then down there in England, you've got these metaphysicians arguing against the positivists, and as if there's some idealist drive behind the history of science. And the meta, if we just understand the metaphysical principles, then those work themselves out and explain the overall development of science.
yeah,
So so this is a really complicated swirl of intellectual culture in the 20th century,
yeah,
and I think Torrance's views are ought to be part of ought to be better understood in context
yeah,
and are really significant in context. He's
yeah.
charting his own course in a way that is affirming a cataphysian approach that liberates all the special sciences
Right.
from any kind of metaphysical straitjacket.
And two other words just to see if they correspond. The a priori prejudice is a prejudgment that can't see the other in a sense. So to say he's standing against all prejudicial thinking that enters the conversation without the ability to leave those prejudgments, the prejudiced judgments. For example, Valentine's Day, it's all just chemistry, right? There's nothing about real human relations that's going on here. It's just our
Mhm.
biological systems, working. It's like, so that would be a prejudice that science can only be the physical and not anything beyond it. And the other, the word that you have used, reductionism, and you have a story about reductionism, right? That with C.S. Lewis, and it was Houston?
Oh, yes. Um, Charles Cotherman, in a wonderful book, To Think Christianly, highly recommend it. He reports a conversation between James Houston. Wait, is it James? James Houston, right? Jim
Yep,
Houston.
yep, Jim Houston.
And C.S. Lewis. And Houston asked Lewis if Lewis could summarize a common thread among all of his works, scholarly, Christian, fiction, nonfiction, etc. And Houston said that Lewis answered immediately against reductionism. It's a wonderful gem in that book about Lewis.
And to tie it to this statement here, we can't begin with reduction. What's the word for it? Things that have been reduced that lose the very nature and character, because the reduction is a metaphysic that blinds us.
Yes. Yeah, right, Marty. Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed.
Going on to number 4 then. In any science, investigations come up against a line beyond which they cannot penetrate and cannot even attempt to pass without inconsistency and error. So he's saying this is a similarity between theology and the other sciences. So take
Yeah.
us into the heart of what he's saying there with that.
You know, what we were saying earlier about questions being raised in cosmology, and the cosmologist being tempted to try to resolve contingency away. That would be an example of this as well. He didn't use that example in these pages, but that fits. That the line beyond which they cannot penetrate, science is always raising these limits, and it's not just a limit of ignorance. It's a limit built into the order that they are studying, and it testifies to the contingent character of created order. And again, he uses brackets in the same
Yeah.
way. And I just think whenever you see brackets in Torrance, think relations of the sciences. You're talking about interdisciplinary relations, and the sciences need to stay in their lane and not appropriate questions. They can raise questions, but they can't answer them by themselves that are more appropriate for other sciences.
So one other word you could help me understand, the word indeterminacy within this particular point.
Yeah,
I couldn't
so
quite get the traction there.
okay, so Torrance gives two examples of what the limits might look like. And he wants to give an example in theology and an example in a non-theological science. So he uses indeterminacy in physics as an example of a limit. We just cannot tell about some uh, subatomic particle uh, there's an indeterminacy in our ability to measure its characteristics. That's a fundamental limit. A similar one would be in theology, being able to talk about heaven or the new creation. As as much as we know about it, um, we can know a lot, especially by looking at Jesus after the resurrection. But gosh, I would really like to know a lot more about heaven and about the new creation.
Yeah.
Got several books on my shelf about it. Smart books, smart people, but they don't answer my questions, and I'm still just staggered trying my imagination reels trying to imagine what the new creation is going to be like. That's all.
Life beyond allergies.
Thank you. Now that's a good one.
The
Yeah.
indeterminacy of that. Okay. So it's part of the whole thing of the humility of the journey is part of what I hear in that.
Yeah, let me just point to my first sub bullet there. Our progress will be endless in terms of ignorance. Have you thought about wanting to forever grow in our awareness of our ignorance? I mean, that's pretty cool to me. That eternal life means that I'm always going to be growing in my awareness of my ignorance.
Yeah.
Because if it's true that the more we know, the more we're aware of what we don't know,
Yeah.
and if it's true that there's an inexhaustibility of the wisdom of creation that God has put into it, that means I get to keep learning through all creation. I'll never come to the end where I understand it all. But if that's the case, my level of ignorance will be more and more obvious to me. The more I learn, the more I will be aware of my ignorance. So 10,000 years from now, I'm going to be more aware of my ignorance.
And
You know?
hopefully more grateful of
Yeah, yeah. So my progress and my knowledge of my ignorance will be endless. Oh well.
yeah. That's great.
That's this idea of the limit.
Okay, we'll take that. And then point five, the challenge of relating ordinary language to scientific language.
So I gave examples there of Trinity, homoousian, even a word like father, where a common term as it's deployed in a science like theological science, we now have to define father from who God is, not from whom our own fathers are.
Uh-huh.
Understand our own fathers in light of the heavenly Father, not vice versa.
Uh-huh.
The same thing happens in science, and this is one of the joys of studying the history of science is when we first see the idea of a Leyden jar being charged or a bunch of Leyden jars set up in a battery, like a battery of cannon. These terms are concrete and understandable. And as the science, say, of electricity progresses, they get more and more abstract, but they still retain some kind of connection with ordinary language. And so through studying the initial deployment of these terms is actually quite helpful in understanding their later use, even when they are more technical, even when the divergence from ordinary language has progressed. Think of planet that just meant wanderer. And now when we say planet, we're not thinking wanderer, we've got a different idea of planet. but this divergence of terms from common language into a technical sense is common in every field of science. And in my opinion, it's one of the joys of studying history of science is to see the
And
evolution and meaning of such terms.
even within my family, my grandmother on my mother's side used to leave a little dish underneath all the electrical outlets because she was afraid the electric current would flow out onto the floor.
Yes.
Because most of our metaphors for electricity are based on fluids.
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
current. It has a pressure,
Yes. Yes.
but that's all metaphor.
I love it. And there were there was the one fluid theory and the two fluid theory. I mean, it absolutely, yeah.
I wondered with his point five, I can't find where I thought he uses the word art to say at some level science is an art. It is a descriptive, artistic reflection that we have to allow for a kind of we can't absolutely pin it down. So the art of giving good illustrations and all that is really part of the scientific process. So that as we begin recognizing in point one, we are all artists, and that's why we do science. We are attempting to engage a real world and to have something that has meaning and purpose to it. And then point three, we're not going to just pull abstract things out of nowhere. We want to make a contribution that doesn't bring something alien to the world, but actually serves in a particular kind of way. And then point four, that we want to stay within the bounds of what art can do, but not in such a way that we don't say anything. We just want to make sure that it provides meaning and doesn't become confusing by the nature of putting confusing kinds of things up. So that in this last sense, in the end, it is an art, and the word beauty that was wrestled with earlier. Beauty is at some level the meaningfulness of both science and theology, providing something that connects, it allows us to participate, it invites us into a knowing and deeper knowing. Does that connect at all?
I think that's a beautiful summary, Marty. Yeah.
So the one other thing just to ask there, the word ecstatic on the bottom of three, your last point, ecstatic, being moved out of oneself. John Zazilus uses the phrase hypostasis and ecstasis, which Alan Torrance said what he means by that is that each of us is a person who's going out to meet another who is also coming out to meet us. In that sense, it seems like it's been removed from its individualized sense of being, in a sense, out of our mind, ecstatic, and it's become relational. Persons in relation, to use McMurray kind of term, or onto-relational in a Torrance kind of term. So I wonder if we would say that good science has a hypostasis and ecstasis. Each science goes out to meet the other as itself, but acknowledging the other. And in that meeting, there is something that is richer and deeper that each gains by virtue of that ecstatic movement of reciprocity. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. I'm not exactly sure what Torrance means by ecstatic, but I like what you just said.
And the word ecstatic, I mean, when somebody's, I came home and I was just ecstatic with joy. I mean, ecstatic so often has a positive sense to it.
Mhm.
There is ecstatic out of your mind, maybe, but I don't know that it's the most common reading that one would have for that. So
Did he put it in quotes? I think he did, or maybe he italicized it. So I'm guessing he's using it with reference to a specific um, philosopher or a specific debate, specific
In New
context.
Testament, the ecstasis, that the Holy Spirit gets us out of ourselves, that we stuck in ourselves are stuck, and only the Holy Spirit, by getting us ecstasis out of ourselves, that's the liberation that comes with the freedom of the Spirit.
okay. So
Perhaps
that would
also
go ahead.
in this context, perhaps he's also using it to mean that the words that we use come from ordinary usage, but as we imbue greater meaning to them. In a
Yes.
sense, there's more to those words, right? And each scientific discipline, like mathematics, will use an ordinary word.
Yes.
An example is like sheaves. And yet in mathematics, it means something very specific. So there is something out of it, right?
Yeah.
It's greater than what that word is
Yeah.
ordinarily.
A kind of elasticity of image and word that allows for space to understand things more broadly than a limited kind of view.
Mhm.
So far we've got, kind of an introduction to the question of just acknowledging there are these many sciences, and theology is one of them, and these 5 points that there are similarities that would say we need to recognize that we're not really on different planets here. We're all neighbors together. One of the points that Polanyi makes, I think, and I heard actually Alan Torrance make, is that these all have communities. Each science has a community with a history, and those histories are important. And you really have to enter the community to understand the nature of the second point, and that is they have unique languages, and those languages are developed. And that was your point, Jung-Il, I think, that the language within each of those communities, you have to enter the community to learn the language to be able to do what it is that the science of that community wants to do. And then there is the sense of, being an addition. You are a member of it, but you're also part of the growing sense of it. There's a passing on. I just think of Jesus and the disciples, that, there's a sense that community has a vision that goes beyond merely existing. When people say, I just want knowledge for knowledge's sake, my mind goes, what? What does that even look like, to just have knowledge for knowledge's sake? That science, and particularly theological science, there is a meaningfulness that is pursued, and that is that we have been met by one who calls us to life, to himself, to be there with him for one another as a community, and to a world who needs what it is that theological science provides. That is an invitation to live into the life for which we were created. So, those are other dimensions that we might say are shared: community, language, and purpose for the discipline. And the word service, Kerry, I think, is a great way to think about what it is that's going on there.
Yeah, very good. Those are all ways in which theological science is like other sciences.
Yeah. Good. Well, this has been, we have, tons of words left on the page that could be talked about. Yes, Jung-Il.
I don't want to open a can of worms, but in what way is Torrance's view of theology different than the way theology was done at the time? Is this something that would be something that theologians themselves would have need to understand and then do theology differently? Or is he just describing theology as done by the theological community and just making it more explicit?
Boy, that's a great question.
He quite specifically cites Bultmann and Paul Tillich, for example, as contemporary theologians with which he flatly disagrees.
Mm-hmm.
And Barth, who he agrees with.
Right.
So
Okay.
to say dogmatics for Karl Barth is the ongoing discussion to answer the question you're talking about. It is the investigation in dialogue with people with whom you agree and disagree, to further the conversation and to clarify the nature of the object of that study, namely the God revealed in the person of Christ.
Yeah.
And so Torrance is certainly dealing with those people who are in academic theology at that time. He wasn't necessarily taking on evangelicals in the United States, probably not even the Methodists, or, there are many who he wouldn't have necessarily been engaging, but many, great Methodists have really picked up on Barth and Torrance as affirming something that would be doing a better theological science than other things that they have seen. So Torrance is part of a conversation that recognizes that there are people who need correction, and there are people with whom he agrees, and that he doesn't want to be the authority. He wants to clarify methods to allow the living God to be the proper authority, and that we live with these many communities and persons, and we say to Paul Tillich, yeah, your ground of being's missing maybe the ground of being, and to say to Bultmann, yeah, you're demythologizing, just looks like Jesus ends up looking like you. I think you've missed the object and made Jesus look like you. And so there's clearly a corrective as well as a progress that is the underlying sense. We can know the living God. We can know with meaning and force and enough authority to serve.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ken and Marty, for those responses, and Young Il for that question. Great question. And I would just say that I think especially with this chapter, but with the whole book, actually, Torrance is truly voicing a vision of theology, a reinvigorating vision of theology as it can engage in a mutually respectful dialogue with other sciences, rather than just receiving the other sciences as if theology has to accept everything that other sciences say, but also rejecting that theology is the Lord of the other sciences. Torrance is articulating a vision of theology as a participant in conversation with other sciences that is more than just superficial, for the health of all. And that's a pretty radical vision for theology in 1969, or when, that's a very, very invigorating.
Yeah. There are three images of people with red shirts on, which red shirt for me is an acknowledgement of Pentecost. And so to say the nature of Pentecost is the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, where people from all over the known world heard in their own language the one message. And this chapter, in a sense, is acknowledging that the work of theological science is a spirit moved. Everyone hears of the one reality born out of the life of God, but in a language that works together, even though it's distinct. Right. So there's a kind of a modern Pentecostal call that is implicit in the theological science of this chapter.
Yeah. I like that.
I gotta go. Sorry.
Good summary.
Okay, blessings on you. I'll see you next week from Princeton. So
wow, wonderful.
I'll be in Princeton, but we will meet at the same bat channel, same bat place. Thank you, Kerry, for a
Thanks, you
wonderful
all.
time together, and everyone else.
Thanks, you all. Good to see you.
Very good. Bye-bye.